As Jacob helped Helen prepare dinner, he was engrossed in learning about the mighty dragon clan. The sound of the front door opening interrupted their conversation.
Sophie is back with her uncle. Why don't you go talk to them? I'll take it from here.
Helen gave Jacob one of her endearing smiles. Jacob returned her smile.
Sure thing.
He walked out of the kitchen and entered the living room, where he saw Sophie in her light blue school uniform sitting and giggling away with a bulky man with bushy eyebrows and big round eyes.
Hello, sir.
Jacob greeted Sophie's uncle politely. The man did not bother replying to Jacob. Instead, he scrunched up his nose in disgust. Sophie didn't try to smooth things out either. She threw her backpack onto the sofa, ran to the kitchen, and started talking to her mom. Jacob felt like he hit a snag with Sophie's uncle within seconds of meeting him. He found himself a bit annoyed at the man he had greeted so kindly. Jacob sat on the sofa and tried to withhold any feelings by reading the study material he brought for Sophie. Minutes passed by, and suddenly, the man said with a grunt,
"So, you're Jacob."
Jacob did not take his nose out of the book, deciding to ignore the uncle. Then he remembered Helen's kindness and the fact that he was to be married to Sophie. He looked up at Sophie's uncle.
Yes, I'm Jacob.
The man did not say anything, but continued to observe Jacob. The uncle didn't take his eyes off Jacob for even 1 second. Jacob didn't think about it at first, but it suddenly dawned on him that her uncle was observing his level of cultivation. He felt chills go down his spine.
Useless. Swallowed Sophie's internal core and had so much time to cultivate, yet no changes to the body.
The man mumbled loudly after a few minutes of observation. His words were harsh. Even though Jacob had a calm nature, he couldn't hold back his anger when it came to his self-respect. He glared at Sophie's uncle. Sophie's uncle and Jacob were staring at each other aggressively when Sophie came out of the kitchen.
Uncle, Mom's asking if you have any preference for dinner tonight.
Ha ha! Anything will be fine, Munchkin. I am not picky.
The man with his bushy eyebrows and big eyes suddenly turned soft like a little sheep when talking to Sophie.
Okay.
Sophie turned around to go back into the kitchen.
Mom, Uncle said anything will be fine. Cook whatever you want.
Jacob noticed that Sophie's uncle had a twinkle in his eyes whenever he saw or talked to Sophie. It was obvious that he loved his niece very much. Sophie came back and skipped happily across the room to sit down next to her uncle.
Uncle, do you remember what you promised me in the car?
All right. I'll give it to you. How could your uncle forget his promise after all, eh?
The man took out a wallet from his pocket and handed her 10 $100 bills to Sophie. He winked at her.
Don't let your father know about this.
Sophie was beaming with joy. She put the money in her glittery pink wallet. She then hugged her uncle around his neck.
You're the best, Uncle Kenneth.
You crazy girl.
Her uncle rubbed her head with joy, and his face was filled with love for his niece. They both continued to ignore Jacob as they fell into their own private conversation. Jacob knew her uncle was not happy with him, but he couldn't do anything about it. Plus, Sophie was much too excited and happy to even notice the tension in the room. Even if she did, she would side with her favorite uncle rather than the stranger she was unwilling to marry. Knowing that Sophie doesn't want this marriage, needless to say her uncle would be even more defiant. Great start in bonding with the family, Jacob. Jacob thought to himself as he continued to ignore the two. He picked up the study material once again and pretended to read them as he brooded in anger. Helen broke the tension by calling them to the dining room for dinner.
Sophie, are you bothering your uncle again?
Helen said reproachfully to Sophie as she entered the room. Sophie was giggling and finally stopped playing the childish rock, paper, scissors with her Uncle Kenneth.
Come on now, you three. Dinner's ready,
said Helen, and promptly left for the dining room. Jacob reluctantly walked to the dinner table. He felt angry and awkward dining with Sophie's uncle, but he couldn't say no to Helen. Plus, it would be rude to excuse himself now. He sat down and kept a straight face, disguising his anger. All four of them sat down to dine while Sophie sat across from Jacob. Her Uncle Kenneth and Helen sat beside him.
This is Dracon's brother, Kenneth. You can call him Uncle, just like Sophie does. Like Elder Liam, he is one of the elders of the North Atlantic. Sophie can explain the details to you later on.
Helen introduced the man to Jacob after she sat down. Jacob nodded curtly at Uncle Kenneth after Helen's introduction. Kenneth grunted in acknowledgement and began to serve himself. Helen noticed that the vibe wasn't quite friendly, so she said with a gentle smile,
All right, let's eat.
She handed Jacob the vegetables as she talked and became a bit more attentive after sensing the tension. Despite Helen's gentle temperament, Kenneth wasn't able to keep himself calm. He blurted out loudly,
Helen, my dear sis-in-law, what were you and Dracon thinking bringing this mere mortal home? Do you think he is worthy of a special girl like Sophie?
Jacob is a really good kid. I like him. I hope this reason is satisfactory to you, Kenneth,
said Helen, gently as ever.
This?
Kenneth was speechless. It was at this moment Jacob realized that Helen wasn't as soft-natured as she seemed. She glared at Kenneth. She had a persona where she never repeated herself. She looked like she could be even more ferocious and dangerous than Dracon, the Dragon King. Kenneth paused for a few moments and said in a low voice,
Others might not know, but I do. If he returns the internal core to Sophie, she will not suffer any harm.
But Jacob will suffer great harm,
Helen replied sharply.
He is just an ordinary human, a mere mortal. Why should we care?
Said Kenneth.
Enough!
Helen was angry.
Your brother isn't here, and you're arguing with me this way? This decision was agreed upon by the Elders' Council. Say no more.
The fight over Jacob had put him in an awkward position. However, he felt his anger melting away now that Helen was defending him.
But
Kenneth was not convinced. He wanted to keep on arguing.
About Sophie's problem. We have our own judgments on what happened. She has to be responsible for what she did. I know you love Sophie, but don't spoil her. You have to stop cleaning up after each time she causes trouble.
Helen's words were firm, and Kenneth finally stopped arguing. However, his face was still filled with disdain. Sophie's face kept turning red, yet she remained silent. She didn't dare to speak up.
It's time for you to keep your temper under control. You're so violent. I would like to see how you are going to get through this year's tribulation with your habit of snapping at everyone around you.
said Helen. Her tone was softer now. After a few minutes of pondering, Kenneth said softly,
I still disagree with the decision of Sophie marrying a mortal.
Helen let out a long sigh. She didn't want to argue anymore.
All right. We heard you, Kenneth.
She looked at Jacob kindly and said,
Let's eat.